My grandmother, on my mother's side, has always been very superstitious. For lack of a better word, she's not religious, but she does believe in a lot of paranormal stuff. Her mother was full-blooded Navajo, and her father was Irish. Either way, she never been anywhere east of Montana, and she grew up in Nevada. One year, when I was in grade school, we went to visit her. Most of the visit was pretty uneventful, typical boring old people stuff. The only interesting thing was that she always kept her curtains drawn shut and would always peek out the window, and when somebody would ask her what she was doing, she would simply reply, "Yenadroshi is watching me." This went on for nearly the entire visit, until a few days before we were due to leave. My grandma and my baby brother, he's 19 now, were in the front yard that evening, when all of a sudden, my grandmother starts shouting, "Get away from that creature, it's not safe." Of course, being in Nevada, we all assumed that my brother had found a scorpion or a rattlesnake, so we all run outside to see my grandmother clutching my little brother and shaking scared against the side of the house. Standing out in the yard was a large, black, Great Dane-sized dog. It was just staring at my grandmother. It then looked up at us, gave a little huff, and bounded off. I don't remember if it moved unusually fast or not, but I do remember it had really deep, yellow eyes. When my mother asked my grandmother what happened, she only kept repeating, "Yenadroshi has found me." She then moved a couple weeks after that. I was told this story once. My dad isn't a bullshit of a liar, so I know the story is true. So this was the very early 80s, and my sister who lived in Canada came down to visit our parents for a weekend. She was staying at a friend's house, who loaned her a car so she could come out. After her visit, she left a little after 9 p.m. She got maybe 7 to 8 miles away when the car broke down. Thankfully, she broke down in front of a friend of the family's house. They let her in to call Dad, and Dad came to get her. The family said she could leave the car in the driveway for the night, and my sister decided to just stay at my parents' for the night. It was now a little after 10 p.m. and pitch black. While my sister and Dad are driving back to the house, they pass through a heavy, wooded area. When out of nowhere, they hear this incredibly fucking loud, inhuman scream that was heard over the engine. Dad slammed on the brakes, and they both started freaking out, when suddenly, a 6-foot tall coyote, walking on 2 legs, with a black-white striped tail, appeared on the side of the road, and proceeded to walk in front of the car. As soon as it passed, that same scream played again, only this time, 10 times more loud. Dad slammed on the gas, and they got the fuck out of there. It was never seen again. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'll share them here. I've been a search and rescue officer for a few years now, and along the way, I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they just wander off the path, or slip down a small cliff, and can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old "stay where you are" thing, and they don't wander far off. But I had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both of these cases bothered me a lot, and I used them as motivation to search even more on the missing person cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together. and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us that he had been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, and that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched the area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she had never came back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours calling her name before they decided to call for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could possibly have gone, because nobody, including her mother or grandpa, saw her come down from the tree. A few times, I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and he tried to lead me straight up cliffs, not hills, not even rocky faces, straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases, we sometimes find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine had led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but everything's so strange out here. One specific sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl had fell down and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance and let out the most haunting, heartbroken cry I ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another search and rescue officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. Apparently, she couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another search and rescue officer because we received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he was. We found him trapped with a broken leg. It wasn't pleasant. He had been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMT guys that the man was saying strange things. He kept talking about how he had been doing fine, and when he got to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment and that he was wearing ski pants. He said he walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said that the man had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he had fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible, muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm actually glad I wasn't there to hear him say it. But can you imagine being trapped with a broken leg and hearing a faceless man running up and down beside you, screaming all night? I once led a trip to the top of Mount Sterling in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and one co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain, and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock that night. I was really into a book I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon and from the position I was in. I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I lay there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving along the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen, watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveyed our camp. I really could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, but may have been 10. He then turned and sat down under a tree facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there, staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do, so I decided to wait it out. And I waited, just staring at the man, while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came up on. I, to this day, have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. There was a group of teens that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return time from a camping trip. A coworker and I head out into the general direction the teens had set off in. We had been hiking for most of the day and seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometers into the woods at this point when we start noticing strange things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings in the trees, a child stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't on the regular trails people would go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Somebody had been there within a couple of hours of us and made these things. Mind you, we're still looking for those teens. We kept on hiking and eventually made camp for the night. Still kind of on edge from what we had seen earlier, but we settled down anyway and go to sleep. We get up with the sunrise, hoping to cover more ground before it gets too hot. We pack up the gear and get ready to go when I noticed a bit of a shirt that had caught on a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close by the teens, when a radio call comes through. The teens had just been found 20 kilometers east of us, and now they're calling everybody back. All those weird things we had seen from the day before came flooding back into my mind, and we wasted no time hiking out of those woods. I'm a ranger at Yellowstone. A couple of weeks ago, I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road, and even further to the park. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, nothing, no ragness at the severed head, perfectly intact. This is weird because I've seen many wolf and bear spoils, and I used to find cougar prey remains in South Dakota with radio tracking just after the cougar made them. This was not any of those things. This head was completely uneaten. Eyes, tongue, everything was still intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet. Right smack in the middle of the trail. And again, no blood. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was a doe, so it had no antlers. Plus, why leave it in the trail? The whole thing, even in broad daylight, gave me chills. Just an ocean of waving grass, bison calmly grazing, and a perfectly clean deer head right on the middle of the path. Our park lets kids from school in so they can look for animals in the forest and the streams. One day, a kid finds molars. The teeth look like they belong to a human, but the teacher said they were a deer's. I dismissed it and completely forgot about it. 2 days later, they found the body with a smashed skull and jaw in another part of the park. All its teeth were missing. A local newspaper covered it, but all they had to say was thank the spooky skeletons for good bones and teeth. I found a deceased man in a tree. I am a seasonal ranger for my local forest district. The rest of the rangers say we found about one self-harm victim a year. So here was the one for this year. When we go around opening parks each day, we drive through to make sure everything is okay. In this instance, I was driving through and had just lost sight of the road when I saw a man hanging from a tree in a clearing. He had hung himself. I called the cops. The medical examiner took an hour to show up, and he was the only one with a ladder long enough to cut the guy down. So basically, I stared at a dead body in a tree for an hour. I was surveying a remote restoration site near an old trail, and I heard someone walking up a nearby road. All the hair on the back of my neck stood up, so I grabbed all my stuff and started casually walking down the trail like I belonged there. I turned the corner and there was a shirtless guy swinging a crowbar around in circles. And when he saw me, he started yelling, "I got a crowbar, I got a crowbar." I think I nodded at him, squeaked something like, "Nice crowbar," and then I ran the mile or so back to my truck. A shed behind an abandoned house with a steel reinforced door broken off the hinges. The windows of the shed were boarded up from the outside. The only thing inside the shed was a queen-size bed with shredded white sheets. I'll never forget that night. I am a park ranger, and that is all you will learn about me, aside from this story. During the summer of 2008, I had been assigned to a watchtower in the middle of a heavily forest area. Most nights, it was uneventful, and I tended to just read a book as I waited for my shift to end. However, this night, when I started my shift, the guy I took over from was shaken up. Concerned, I asked what was wrong. All he did was shake his head and said, "There are things in the woods." He didn't say anything else and just left me standing there like a jackass. Jerk. Well, I set up for the night and took out my book. It was The Mailman, and I found myself surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Sometime around an hour into my shift, something struck the window. I jumped up and quickly sat the book down. Before checking it out, I had expected it was either a big bug or some poor bird. It was a bird, alright, but not what I had been expecting at all. This bird was dead long before it had collided with the window, both wings torn right off and stripped of all feathers. It was bound together with straps made from long grass blades. This was the clear evidence that this was man-made. I quickly took out my flashlight and began scanning the area beneath me. I couldn't see much through the woods. However, as I did a quick double take, I swear I saw a dark shape dart away from the light. I feel this needs some elaborating. I could barely make out anything, but when I brought my light over this thing, I only got a brief glimpse. I literally couldn't describe it for the life of me. This thing was fast. Too fast. Alright, listen up, you punks. If you're out there, show yourself right now. I used my most commanding voice possible. Nothing. As I drew my pistol, I heard the radio crackle. Naturally, I went to check and picked up the receiver. As I held it up to my ear, I could only hear static, so I at first assumed there was a glitch. But right as I decided to set it down, something stopped me. Call it intuition, something just wasn't right. And then I realized what it was. I could hear something over the radio. It was faint, so I really had to strain to hear it. Slowly, I could make out what sounded like faint, low humming. There was a pattern to it. A steady beat that started low, building up, then carefully dropped back down in an instant. I don't know how long I was listening to that humming sound, but eventually I turned off the radio, ready to radio it in. Then I realized I could still hear the humming. Without a second thought, I drew my pistol and turned around on my heel before steadily walking back outside. That humming sounded like it was all around me, following that same pattern. I still had to strain to make it out, but there was no question it was there. I swiveled around, pistol aimed at empty air. Every part of me was screaming to call for backup, but I wasn't sure what I needed backup for. I needed some proof of what I was dealing with, so I waited, on guard and ready, and then it stopped. As I became accustomed to the silence, I couldn't hear anything, not even a bug chirping. Cautiously turning my flashlight back on, I pointed it down at the base of the tower. Nothing whatsoever. Then I heard a creak. I immediately spun around, processing this information. At first, I dismissed it as the wood, but then there was another creak, and another. Something was up here with me. It took me a few moments to realize that it was just around the corner. In that moment, fight or flight kicked in full gear, and I chose fight. I rounded the corner and found nothing, absolutely nothing. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was nervous, but I still had a job to do, and with no other option, I decided to call for backup, which I should have done that a long time ago. I realized that when I saw the receiver had been cut right off, I stared, dumbfounded by a few moments before grabbing my walkie-talkie instead. But when I turned it on, all I got was a harsh whine right in my ear, which caused me to drop it as I recovered. Once I had, I immediately tried to find it, but it was gone. My situation was desperate. I was now completely cut off with some thing or other that seemed to defy all sense. If I was going to make it out of this, I had to stay put and wait for someone to come check on me. I still had my pistol drawn, waiting and waiting. I then quickly shined my flashlight outside one last time, and this time, I finally saw them, standing among the trees, staring up at me. They had been avoiding me all this time, so to see so many of them, you might be wondering what they were. And I'd rather not tell you, for my sake. I was at my limit then, and screamed, turning off my flashlight and pointing my gun right at the door. There, I stayed for the rest of my shift, unwilling to move from that spot. I consider it a miracle I lasted for the rest of my shift. By the time someone finally arrived to see why I wasn't checking in, I poured out every single thing I had gone through. At first, the other ranger looked at me like I was crazy, but when he asked if I had any proof, something landed on the roof of his vehicle. It was another dead, naked, and wingless bird wrapped in grass. Needless to say, we booked it right out of there. When I got back and made a report about what happened, I demanded to speak with the last guy who had been on the previous shift. I really wanted him to have it for not warning me of what was out there. But here's the thing, we never found him. We searched high and low, checked every single record for a trace. We tried to look up his name, when we could remember it, but it seemed like he never existed in the first place. So, what the hell took his shift? When I was a child, it was just me and my mother. We lived in a property owned by my grandma, a 3-story old farmhouse right at the fringe of the woods. It was far off the road, down a long, unlit gravel driveway. It felt very isolated at night, being so distant from any other houses. It was set in an area that wasn't inhabited for 30 years before we started living in it. Quite often, I was a fairly rambunctious child, so while my mom went off to work, I would occasionally skip the morning bus to school and stay home alone all day. The big house had a habit of feeling incredibly lonely, so I spent most of my time playing in the forest out in the back, some distance into the woods, far enough that I could hear my mother when she called. There was a toppled pine tree which had crashed into another. An even larger trunk on its way down was now frozen there, forming a long arc over the forest floor. I love to climb up the jagged stump at the base of this fallen tree and then steady myself to a point just above the middle. I was never able to make it all the way to the top because it just got too steep for me to continue any further. And I had a bad habit of freaking out from how high up I was. One day, I was sitting in my usual spot on the fallen tree, which was a good distance from the ground, just listening to the birds singing and simultaneously feeling the warmth of the sun on my neck, when I heard something strange from underneath that paralyzed me in shock. Hey kid. I was gripped by a sudden strong surge of fear for a moment. The voice had come from directly underneath me. I strained to look down, but I couldn't see anything over the ledge. For a long time, I just sat there in absolute silence, and I was at the point where I was almost soon to convince myself that I had imagined hearing a man's voice at all. I know you can hear me. His voice was much louder this time, as I yelled something out and scrambled up the log a bit higher. Trembling nervously, I dug my fingernails into the bark and held tight for dear life. I sat there, trying to collect my nerves for God knows how long. Even though I couldn't see it, the presence of the thing underneath me was still clear, was much softer and more cautious this time, and when I listened closely, I swear I could hear the faintest echo of a human breathing. Gathering all my courage, I vowed to prove to myself that it was all my imagination by leaning over the ledge as far as I possibly could without slipping right off. Digging hard into the bark behind me, I stretched out along my arms and peered over, getting a full view of the empty forest floor and undergrowth, when suddenly, "Come down here or I'll come up and grab you." It was so loud. It was as if it was being screamed right in my face. I released my grip on the tree in fright and plunged off the platform. I was saved only by grabbing a nearby branch, and for one awful second, my bare legs dangled in the cool air. When I pulled myself up, I ran at full speed to the top of the collapsed pine, to the point I had never reached before. I sat there, just below the rustling canopy, pissing myself and staring at the distant base where the splintered wood rose, fully expecting at any moment to see someone crawling rapidly up the pine towards me. Instead, all I heard was the wind whistling in the leaves above and below me, and occasional snippets of birdsong. It was about 2 hours before my mother got home and found me, after much worry, searching, trembling, and crying at the top of the fallen tree. Although this incident spooked both me and my mother, in time I somehow recovered, exhibiting the naive hard skin of a child, even though I never went as far into the forest as I used to, and never again even approached that fallen tree. Once, when I was 12, I had the chore of taking firewood from the shed out back, just at the edge of the woods, and to bring it back inside the house. It was a tiresome job, and I always chose to do it at dusk, when the air was brimming with mosquitoes and a swampy fog that usually coated the lawn. By the time I had my last round, I would sprint back to the house, spooked. One of my least favorite things about this job was that the shed was full of barn owls. If you have never seen a barn owl's face staring at you from a dark roof corner, then you will know how uncomfortable that shed made me. One of these nights, it got mistier than it had ever been before. A thick silver fog covered everything and limited my line of sight to a short sphere around me. Even though the shed wasn't far from the house, I found myself feeling disoriented, and more than once I walked in the wrong direction, both times for some reason walking straight into the woods. By the time I had reached my last load, it was too foggy to see the street. My eyes stung in the moisture, and it made my vision blur. Lurching forward, I managed to walk headfirst into a tree. Doubling over and dropping all of the wood, I was bundling onto my feet with a hard crunch. As I went to pick them up, with my foot throbbing pretty hard, I realized that the ground was too misty for me to see my own knees. I decided to head to the house since we had more than enough wood for one night. However, it was getting to be pretty dark, and I couldn't make out any signs of which direction I was heading in. Even though I cautiously walked for several feet in all directions, trying to figure out my position in the mist, I still couldn't figure out any point of identification. I couldn't even locate the fence or the gate, and the more I walked, the more I seemed to stumble into trees, pine needles, and mud crunching under my feet instead. After a while, I finally realized that I couldn't even find the shed anymore. Cursing myself for being so dumb while trying to ignore my thumping heart and sense that something else was at play, I became aware that I was lost somewhere in the forest. I then started screaming out for my mother at the loudest possible volume I could, but was only met with a resounding silence from the depths of the mist all around from where I stood, affirming that I had wandered too far from the house to be heard. As a deep panic started to settle on me, I noticed a glimpse of something pink moving against a nearby pine trunk. Coming closer, I saw that it was a ripped out square of pink paper. On it, there was an arrow pointing left. It looks vaguely like something my mom would make, I rationalized to keep me from getting lost. So I followed the direction set by that green arrow, shivering in the increasing cold. I kept walking for about 5 to 10 minutes before needing to stop to take a breath. My heart was pounding so fast, it was beginning to hurt. As I was sitting down, however, I spied what appeared to be another note hanging on a nearby trunk. I noticed this one was embedded with a long nail. It bore another arrow, this one pointing up, and a small, sloppy written note that said, "This way." Despite my increasing panic, I convinced myself that these notes were my only shot at getting back before nightfall. I was desperate to get the hell out, and my eyebrows were cold with sweat, so I followed the green arrow to a point where I could just dimly make out another spot of pink up an incline of collapsed stumps and leaf litter. At this point, it was getting pretty dark, and I had to strain both my eyes just to see a few meters ahead of me, following the green arrows, feeling more and more lost of where I was. I stumbled through the woods, groping out in the mist to feel for trees, even though I was terrified of something unseen grabbing my arm. I came across the third green note, which had another arrow pointing up again. This one led to a steep slope that I didn't recognize being anywhere near my house, and it was with a poorly drawn smiley face right above it. At this stage, I became too freaked to cope and started to cry there a little as I slumped against the pine stump. The possibility that I would be out in these woods all night was beginning to sink in, like a syringe being driven into the veins within my arm. I caught a glimpse of another pink square in the near distance. Squinting hard, despite the previous week's nonstop rain, I read it from afar. What I read made my blood turn cold. I stood to my knees, dead silently, wobbling on them in fear. My ears were sensitive to any tiny prickle of noise in the mist. For a long time, I stood there in the rolling fog, reading that horrible note over and over again, until a snapping stick somewhere behind me caused me to sprint blindly, twigs snapping at my ankles and cutting up my face as I ran. Written on the note in big green letters was my name. It felt like I was running for hours. All the while, the rain and mist lapped at the back of my neck like the decaying breath of someone running right behind me. Somehow, I made it back to the house. All the lights were off, and I struggled to find the keys for a moment. When I found them, I bolted indoors and quickly crawled into bed, where I remained unsleeping till morning. My mom just thought I had come inside and gone to bed and hadn't thought to leave the lights on. It was a miracle, aka some freakish coincidence, that I even found the house that night at all. The final incident at that damn house was witnessed only by my mother. Up until then, she had never experienced any of the strange things as I had, even though we mutually shared the same oppressive quality that the house's interior had on us and its placement in the woods. Although I was obviously never a popular kid, by living way out in the country in the opposite direction from everyone else at my school, I did make some tight friends in my first year of high school. One of these friends, Amanda was her name, invited me over one night and I accepted. My mother drove me out to the place, which was about 3 miles away, then drove back home. The night went well. We watched a horror movie, devoured some pizza, smoked a little pot. My mother went home alone, where she intended to get some writing done. She worked for a magazine at that point. It was about midnight when I received an off-putting text from Mom in all caps. "Is this a prank? I need to know immediately." Thinking it was some kind of joke, I texted back, "Calm yourself. Is what a prank?" She responded immediately, "Are you at the house?" Of course, I responded no. I didn't receive another message until around 3 a.m. when she told me to go to my grandma's in the morning and to not by any means dare go home. I remember those drops of rain the day I went to my grandmother's and how terribly soaked I was when I finally got there. It was nearly 2 towns away. I had to fight the temptation to go home and drop off my bags. But Mom's disturbing messages from last night were enough of a warning not to do so. When I arrived, Mom and Grandma were having lunch. At first, my mother seemed to be in some sort of a composed state, but when I got a better look at her, I noticed that all of the color had drained from her face and she was slightly trembling. At one point, she even sent a small glass crashing to the floor after flinching at the cat brushing around her ankles. It wasn't until later that night, when my grandma was sound asleep, that she told me what happened. She even went further as to forbid me from telling old grandma, out of fear that it would horrify her superstitious soul too much. This was what happened the night when I was at Amanda's, and she described it in detail. My mother was sitting on the first story in the living room, where she sat on the couch by the fire, curtains open to the view of the sunset on the canopy, going over her latest draft. At first, it was so faint that she barely noticed it, but after a while, my mother became aware and vaguely irritated by tiny thumping noises near her head at the window. When she went over to investigate, she saw a fat brown moth of a kind we often get at that place, buzzing madly into the glass. Reasoning that this was the cause of the sound, she returned to her work, however, feeling rattled in some way. It was when the noises started to get sharper and louder that she paid more attention and saw that rocks were being thrown at the window from the total blackness of the forest edge. She saw them appear from the shadows of the bush and then fall in an arc and bounce off the window. Looking carefully, she could see some cracks from where some heavy ones had hit, right beside where her head had been moments before. Captivated, she tried to peer into the darkness enough to make out where the rocks were being thrown from. Then, with a startled shock, she jumped back from the window as she saw me standing half behind a tree right near the window, grinning wide and staring at her. My one visible eye stretched wide open, showing all the white. She barely let out a scream, seeing her own daughter standing there, just staring and smiling. Not only did this figure not move or blink, it was standing by one of the nearest pines, far from where the rocks were shooting up out of the bush, as they continued to do so in a loud downpour. My face continued to press out at her, smiling, thinking this was all some kind of sick prank. My mother shouted my name at the top of her lungs. However, instead of responding, the mouth of this thing behind the tree just started moving, as if it were saying words silently, really, really fast. Suddenly, it turned its head to the side, and it seemed to be speaking with someone else behind the tree, my mom said, who couldn't be seen. But she could see a formless black shape hanging against the other side of the tree. The girl that looked like me kept staring at my mother and doing the silent, speed-talking thing, then turning and whispering to the thing next to her. Then she would turn back and start up again. Breaking the spell, she suddenly pointed straight at my mother and started laughing. My mother screamed and fled to my bedroom on the second story, where she shut herself in and sat at the far end of the bed as the rocks began to pitter-patter against the window downstairs. In my room, my mother said she did not feel safe. There was an awful smell and a weird humming noise in the walls, as she described. She tried to pray for a time before giving up and just listening to the rocks pelt the walls and windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, she caught the distinct sound of a window actually smashing and the weird, continuous humming. Listening more carefully, she could identify it as the softest hint of a mumbling voice. In absolute horror, she recognized the voice, and then, too afraid to look, she tilted her head up to the closet door, where an awful, white face could be seen staring right at her, with its mouth contorting and gapping in what sounded like highly sped up whispering. The closet door was only a meter from my mother. It then started to open slowly. My mother immediately bolted to the door, only to fumble with the lock as bigger and bigger rocks came crashing through the window, which burst apart in a spray of glass shards before finally getting out. Running out the house, completely keeping her eyes off the woods, getting into her vehicle and driving off. She said that she glanced back right at the end of the drive, and she saw two unmistakable human forms standing at my broken bedroom window, watching as her vehicle got further and further away from our house. This would be their final farewell, as my mother never stepped foot in that place again. As my mother told this story, she broke down into tears. I didn't doubt her, and I still don't. I truly believe that she experienced what she said she did. It was also quite clear that we were done living in that house for once and for all. I only went back once with my dad, who I rarely see now. He came from another state to help us move. Mom had already found a place in town and moved in. My dad and I just loaded up his truck with all that was left inside there. It was silent, sunny morning when we removed all the stuff and emptied the place. I wish I could say there was some closure, some final spooking to cap it all off, but there wasn't. It was just a relief to be out of there. There are, however, two things that I have to mention. When we checked the house for any signs of intruders, we found that several windows, including one in my bedroom and the kitchen, had been smashed and rocks were lying on the floor. 2. Dad went out into the trees for a bit to take a leak. When he came back, he asked me how long we had the swing set for. Needless to say, we never had a swing set, so I was fairly unsettled to discover that in the week since we had been gone, someone had assembled a rope swing set from one of the highest branches of the old pine over the ridge, against which was the fallen log I had stopped climbing many years ago. It was obviously new rope and a nicely polished, sanded down wooden set. Dad, wanting to keep my mind from recent events, said that a neighbor maybe set it up, not realizing it was on our property. Of course, he knew as well as I did that we had no neighbors for at least a mile in any direction. There were no houses in all that space, and never in my time living there did I ever see any other signs of humans living. But I let it all go and was pleased enough just to say good riddance to that horrible place as we drove off for good. For the most part, I found it best to try and forget what happened at that place. Sometimes I just can't help but ponder it, even though it's been long enough now that I no longer feel scared talking about it, but for a long while I couldn't. My grandma just recently sold the house to a new family, that being a young couple and their little son, shortly after we moved out. Despite my mother's desperate insistence that it be left empty, now she refuses to talk about what happened altogether. I'm less anxious about it, even though sometimes I can't help but let my imagination get the better of me. All I can do is think of that old house, the fallen down tree, the new family that moved in, and the swing out back, gently spinning in the breeze, as that little boy toddles, obviously, towards it. So I used to have tons of little paranormal experiences up until I turned 18, and then they just stopped, and nothing for nearly 20 years. But then about 6 months ago, I started getting super interested in the paranormal again, and I'm always reading people's experiences on here or listening to a podcast, and things have started to happen again. I believe the more attention you give to the paranormal, even indirectly, by reading about others' experiences can give them enough energy to interact with you. Some backstory before I get into my latest happenings. I started dating my ex-wife in 2009. We moved into our house in 2010-11. Her family owned it before us, so she grew up in it basically. They always believed there was a presence in the house, but apart from a dumb teenage girl moment with a friend claiming to be a sensitive or another girl claiming to see something, no real experiences ever happened. But as adults, when we moved in, we always sensed something here. Not really malevolent, but powerful enough of a presence to put you, and sometimes also company, uneasy. But for literally a decade, zero actual experiences. Nothing unexplainable, even when talking about the paranormal, and even making jokes, and trying to stir something out of sheer curiosity. Then, in 2020, we separated, and I moved out. In this new place, I sometimes feel a small presence. I chalk it up to either imagination, or maybe there's someone watching over me. So, who really knows what's there? Which we can't even see. We can only speculate. Now cut to 6 months ago, when I started to get super drawn to the paranormal again, and I began reading people's stories again, like every night, in bed, as I'm laying down to sleep. There was a story I shared with you all before, about my experience with the Black Horseman, and I mentioned how it seemed to, as I call it, stir shit up, as in, if you give them attention, they feed off that energy enough to actually interact with you somehow. And now it seems like the same thing is happening all over again. I'm starting to feel a presence, much stronger. Weird, for sure. But let me continue with the story. Around October, I got a new experience. I was in a basement bedroom, only 2 floors. The stairs are loud. You can always hear them, even over the TV or music. Even when you try to be sneaky, they're just so damn loud. On one morning, around 6:18, I remember exactly because my morning ritual is to wake up before any other roommate, get dressed, and relax on my couch playing on my phone until 6:30 when I walk out to leave for work. All before any of my roommates wake up for their routine. So I'm in my room sitting on my couch, looking at my phone waiting on time to leave. Dead silence in the entire house. Sitting on the couch in my room, facing my open bedroom door, I hear the loud creaky stairs as something slowly walks down to the basement. All 13 steps. I think this is kinda strange, as I watch the doorway into the hall. There's no reason for anyone upstairs to come down here. They have their own bathroom up there, and nobody gets up before me. But I think maybe it's a roommate coming to talk to me before I leave. I then wait about 1 or 2 minutes. No sounds. No lights turn on or off. And then I hear the same loud steps going back upstairs. Then, this is the weird part. If anyone is walking upstairs, I hear them. At all times, the floor is so loud and creaky. So if someone goes upstairs, you always hear what they walk to afterwards also. But this time, there's silence after the footsteps go up, which is impossible. I even tested it with a roommate later that day. Also, when I came home, I told each roommate if they were up during that time frame, but they weren't. I did everything in my power to explain it away, but there is zero logic to disprove it. I tried. Here's my next experience. Me and my ex-wife are still friends. She's still in our old house, and we're getting ready to sell it and move to another state. She's moving to a new state with a new boyfriend, and I will be moving to my home state. So we decided, since her roommates are moving out, and we have to work on the house to get ready to sell it, I figured I would move back in, since I would be there so often anyway, and we get along well enough. Immediately, the presence in the house is stronger than I had ever felt before. Every night, I'm still reading and listening to stories and to a podcast in bed. Getting very creeped out, dumb and brave, I continue anyway. One evening, I go with my ex-wife to help do some janitorial service at a church for a mutual friend who she helps out for some side cash. She's been doing so for months, and she asked if I wanted to come along this time because she hates going there alone, because she thinks it's haunted and gets spooked out. There is this specific room she hates and feels like there's always a presence in that room, and it makes her extremely uneasy. A friend was hanging out with us and decided to tag along with us. So the three of us get there, and she tells me to handle that room because I don't rattle easily. So she's in the bathrooms. The friend is just standing in the hall talking to us, and I'm in the hall running a cord, and I walk past the door to that specific room. I looked at our friend as he turns completely white and says as I walked past it, the door slowly opened, even though I had just asked the ex-wife to come unlock it for me so I could vacuum it, so I know for a fact it was just locked. Take that as you will, just the door coming unlatched, or paranormal. But it felt unlikely, it just unlatched, as it is a heavy solid built door with a sturdy lock. They lock every door in the church for whatever reason. Anyway, I tried recording some audio in the room alone a couple of times hoping to catch something, but I have captured nothing so far. I'll keep trying whenever I get a chance. I also say whenever I leave, you are not allowed to follow us home or attach yourself to us, and you are not allowed to feed off our energy before we leave the church every time. Here's my third experience. On the first week of December, my ex-wife has gone out of town with her new boyfriend, leaving me alone in the house for a couple of months. A buddy of mine who is pretty sensitive to spirits and such is visiting, and we end up talking about the paranormal, and I bring up the strong presence here which has felt much stronger since being alone. He also mentions that he felt something watching us from the kitchen the whole time that evening, and nervously changed the subject. That night, I go to bed, read some stories here, get all spooked, and get sleepy, put my phone on the charger, turn off the lights, and lay down. I'm still very much awake after only about a minute or two since turning off the lights, when I feel something on the bed next to my foot. This feeling, it feels like someone took their open palm and just firmly patted the bed. I know I'm alone in this house. There's no way it was a person. So I calmly said, do not mess with me while I am in bed, and you are not allowed to feed off my energy, and please respect my home and my boundaries. I try not to freak out as I tuck the blanket under my body as if it was a shield and would protect me, and I eventually went to sleep. After this third experience, and after that night, I don't read spookies every night anymore. All this shit needs to calm down until I'm at least not home alone. But here I am, typing this at midnight, when I should actually be going to sleep, and I should mention that I'm still home alone. So I guess we'll see if I have another one to report soon. A couple of years ago, I went to a rehab in South California for alcohol and drug addictions. My family and friends were beginning to worry about me a lot, so if anything, I did it more for them than for me. I was there for almost 4 months. We all got pretty close. However, tragedy struck and my roommate decided to hit the needle again. Needless to say, that was the last time he ever would, as he overdosed in his apartment, collapsed in his closet with a needle still in his arm. This is where some friends and I found him, motionless. We called 911 immediately, but it was too late. A few weeks passed, and we are still living in the same apartment that he passed away in. Being sober, and not really knowing what sober people do with their time and lives all day, we did a bunch of random shit to keep our minds off our old habits. On this one specific night, we decided to use a Ouija board. We all sat in the living room and began. We said the prayer, put our hands on the planchette, and started asking routine questions and got nothing. We were about to quit when someone had the brilliant idea of going into our friend's room that passed away. Sitting in the room, we pulled everything out, redid the procedure, and asked for, let's call him Brad. We then asked, Brad, are you still with us? Surprisingly, the planchette went to yes. Both a little freaked out and a little excited, we continued. We then asked simple things like if he was okay, etc. Everything was fine until we asked Brad why he did it. The planchette then went to BADGNE. We thought about this for a while and asked, is Brad gone? The planchette then started moving like I've never seen it move before. Z-O-Z-O-Z-O. Over and over again. I had no clue what the fuck this was, but I turned to my friend, and his face was white. When the planchette finally came to a rest, I asked my friend what was wrong. We need to quit. We need to stop this right now. Being a huge tough guy, it was strange to see him so scared. Stop being a pussy, I jokingly said. That's Zozo, a Ouija board demon. He acts to be a friend or family member and then finally reveals himself. I took this in and kind of chuckled to myself. That friend took off and went back to his apartment while the two of us stayed, laughing at the demon and cussing him out. We finally asked what he wanted, and the planchette pointed right at me. Terrified, I asked, what do you want with me? It then started moving to the letters H-E-L-L. You want me in hell? It then moved towards yes. Are you going to kill me? The planchette stayed at yes. Getting a little freaked out, I asked, how are you going to kill me? It then started moving towards F-I-R-E. And then out of nowhere, the planchette shot towards one of our candles, knocking it onto the floor, starting a small fire on the carpet. We quickly put it out, and as we were doing so, we looked back at the Ouija board, terrified. We picked up the planchette and walked back to the board and said goodbye. And then we went outside to burn that board that same night. I refused to sleep in that apartment after that night, and I ended up relapsing after going back home. So I beg you, don't ever play with a Ouija board. And Zozo, I hope we never meet again. So I never had a Ouija board experience because I was always told to never play with them. But recently, I was at the mall looking for a game called What Do You Mean? As I was looking at the games, I noticed that there were Ouija boards right there with the rest of the games. When out of nowhere, one of the workers comes up to me and says, "Hey, you want a Ouija board? I'll give you 50% off." He seemed very adamant, like your typical salesperson, but something about him just didn't seem right. I don't even know where he came from. It seemed like he just popped up out of nowhere. But he was wearing a worker's uniform, so I assumed he worked there. I responded with, "No thanks, I'm not looking for a Ouija board." And then he just walks away to the back room. I thought it was weird though, because I was looking at the board games, and the Ouija boards were about 3-4 feet away from me. And to finish it off, the Ouija boards were like 30 plus, and I didn't see a 50% off sign anywhere. The whole situation was weird. I mean, I did have enough money if they were 50% off, but still, I wasn't looking for a Ouija board. I needed this What Do You Mean game to play with my family. As I got the game that I was looking for, I went to the cashier to check out, and as I was walking out the store, I didn't see that employee that had told me about the 50% off. I turned back, and I saw him. He was just standing at the back of the store, looking at me in a real creepy way. Once I got home, I told my family about the whole situation at the store, and a few of them said that it was most likely the devil or a demon trying to get me to buy it. It's weird, I know, but I wanted to share the story with everyone to see what everyone thinks about this and what you would have done in this situation. This story happened on October of 2004, back when I was still a third-year high school student. My friends and I stuck around the school late at night after having our annual Halloween party. We had agreed to try out my friend's Ouija board. It wasn't the brightest idea, but we needed a thrill. We found a nice spot under a huge tree and proceeded with our half-assed ritual. It was a total of 5 of us, 2 boys and 3 girls, and we were expecting some kind of paranormal contact. Rumors had it that our school was haunted, but we never really experienced anything firsthand, and it was Halloween when all the spirits came out to play, so we all wanted to get spooked. Also, we never seen a Ouija board firsthand before, so we were pretty excited. Our school was an old Spanish colonial house, built in the 1800s when the Spaniards still occupied the Philippines. We were in a section of the school that doesn't get used often, located beside a creepy old Jesuit house. People only go there when they needed to use the restroom, store equipment on one of the sheds, or make out with their boyfriend or girlfriends. We sat down in the middle of an open space, with only an exposed light nearby illuminating the surroundings. We were all having a laugh, scaring each other with what-if scenarios. It was your typical dumb kids doing dumb things. My friend who brought the Ouija board then placed it in the middle of our circle. If I remember correctly, it was the glow-in-the-dark one, which we found hilarious, but it gave us the chance to see what was in the dark. Not knowing what to do, and going after what we seen in the movies, we all then began to place our index finger. We sat there looking at each other, until one of us said, okay, what's next? We didn't know if there was a proper way to start the ritual. Plus, the board didn't come with instructions, so we decided to just throw in a question. Is anyone there? I called out into the darkness. If there are spirits living here, please talk to us. One of the girls joined in. We obviously had no idea what we were doing. Still, nothing. Not even the slightest bit of wind. One of my friends jerked the planchette, and the girl who brought the Ouija board screamed, breaking the silence. We all laughed at how ridiculous it was. After a bit of joking around, we decided to give it another chance. We all placed our index fingers on the planchette once more and asked, if there's anyone there, we would like to make contact. Don't break the circle, one of my friends jokingly said. Shut up, I whispered. We were just about ready to give up when the wind started to pick up. The stillness broke and the darkness around us seemed to move. Just a coincidence, we thought. Okay, but don't break the circle, I told everybody. Is anyone there? I was actually pretty excited. It was like a scene from a movie with dirt and leaves swirling around us. Guys, I'm scared, my friend sitting beside me said. My mom warned me about playing with forces we don't know. Did you die here? Were you killed during the war? Are you the headless priest? Do you know Jose Rizal? Are you a hottie? My friend giggled. At this point, we were all throwing random stupid questions, but nothing. This is bullshit. I don't want to do this anymore, my friend said. We were all thinking the same as well. Just then, a group of dogs from the neighboring house started barking at us through the chain link fence. These 6 dogs were growling and showing teeth. We all screamed and without finishing the ritual, ran right out of there. We didn't see each other until after Halloween break, and this is where the story gets creepy. One of the girls told us about an experience she had the night after playing with the Ouija board. She said she got home late after hanging out with her friends from the neighborhood when she realized she forgot the keys to her house. So she called her brother up, who was then still sharing a room with her, and what he said creeped her out. He told her that she was already home. He claimed to have seen her walk in a while ago, and that she looked really tired, and saw her head straight to bed. Creepy, but no need to freak ourselves out, was what we thought at least. Besides, her brother must have been tired and seeing things. But then my other friend started telling us about an encounter she had that Halloween night. She said she was going up her room when the lights started flickering as she was ascending the staircase. Typical horror movie visuals. After this, she said she saw the door to her room open and a dark figure stepped out and stood atop of their staircase. She couldn't make out the face of the figure, but she said that she couldn't move and she felt a horrible dread as the figure stared down at her. No way, my best friend who just joined the conversation said in disbelief. Something happened to me as well. He recalled that he was sleeping one night when he woke up feeling really uncomfortable. He described his vision as having TV-like static and a feeling of heaviness surrounded him. He looked around the room and that's when he saw a bloody, charred face with red eyes grinning at him through the window. I couldn't believe what I was hearing because, in reality, I had an almost run-in with something that night as well. After the ritual, I was sleeping in our sedan on the way home after fooling around with the Ouija board when I felt our car jerk. I woke up instantly. Looking out the window, I found out that we had been hit by a huge oil tanker. I panicked and leaped out of the car. But lucky for me, my mom and I survived the crash, since the front of the car was a total wreck. I still don't have an explanation why those things happened to us, but thank God nothing happened after that. And ever since that day, I have never played or gone near a Ouija board ever since. Most people, when they tell stories of Ouija boards, it's when something terrible happens, like a demon possessing a friend, or somehow a ghost begins to haunt someone's home. Yet my story is kinda different. I'll start off with saying that this happened when I was in 9th grade. My friend had gotten a Ouija board for her birthday from her cousin, and my friends and I were dying to play. We told our friend, who I'll name Catherine for the sake of the story, to wait until we all got together to play the board. Our parents then drove us over to Catherine's house on a Friday after school so we could hang out and spend the night. None of us told our parents about what we were planning to do, since all of us came from strict religious backgrounds. We ate dinner and we also got in our pool, then got out the rules for the board and we set everything up. The door had been shut, the ceiling fan was turned on full speed to drown out our questions, and we were all excited about what we were about to experience. There were 4 of us there, including me, Catherine, Jackie, and Beth. We sat in a tight circle around the board, and we all nervously set our hands on the planchette. Beth greeted the spirit who owned the board once we touched it, and we all started giggling. None of us really believed in spirits, so we weren't too worried about the planchette, quote, moving, or something in the room breaking. The first question was asked by Jackie, who asked if there was anyone there. The planchette didn't move, and again my friends and I started laughing. Catherine then asked the question, "What is your name?" Suddenly, the planchette started sliding across the board. We were all freaked out, and Jackie even screamed. Catherine started asking who was moving the piece. She got kinda angry and started watching the planchette with disgust on her face. MARTHABANKS. Suddenly, we turned to see Catherine shocked, and a horrified look was painted on her face. Beth started laughing and asked how we came up with a name that quick, following with the question, "How old were you?" 6, 1. Jackie and I noticed that Catherine had started to cry, very silently, but she was close to sobbing, big tears falling down her face. "How are you today?" she asked through tears. Beth had now noticed Catherine's sadness too. I asked her what was going on and why she was so sad, but she didn't answer. G-O-O-D. Catherine laughed a little bit, then asked if heaven was nice. All four of us stared at the board, unmoving our hands from the piece. The planchette slowly spelled out, ITSBEAUTIFUL. Catherine quickly said goodbye, without any of our consent, before removing her hands from the piece, pulling ours away with hers. The rest of the night she didn't speak of the incident, no matter how many times we asked. Years later, when I was in 12th grade, I had called her up after not speaking to her in a while. I was still friends with Beth, and I had gotten way out of touch with Jackie. I still spoke with Catherine, but not as often as I used to. She had moved away, and she wasn't available to call much. So I finally got her attention one day, and brought up the night where we played her Ouija board, and asked if she still had the board. She told me that she had asked her mom to sell it, since it was taking up space in their storage closet. Yet, Catherine sent another text that got me very curious. "Oh, wait, was that the day I got super upset?" I texted back to confirm her question, and asked her why she was so sad. I now know that Martha Banks was her grandmother, who got a stroke when she was 53, another when she was 57, and the last one when she was 61, which killed her in a couple of days. I know it's a very touchy subject, but Catherine has said that she was almost certain that it was her grandmother. One of the reasons being that a couple of days after all of us had come over, she walked out to the kitchen to get a snack and saw that a picture had fallen down in the living room. When she went to go pick it up, she noticed that all of the pictures that were originally in the room were still there, and that the picture didn't have a frame. She then told me that as soon as she picked up the picture, tears poured from her face. The picture was one of her and her grandmother when she was a little baby. She had never seen it before. This memory always makes me go on the side of Ouija boards when someone says that you shouldn't play. Of course, there are dangers, but taking a risk can allow you to learn a lot of things. And this memory, for Catherine, I think, will allow her to remember that her grandma is safe and happy for all of her days. Someone, please. I don't know what to do. I try to tell my wife about this, but she's a science teacher, and thanks to my history of practical jokes, she thinks I'm just kidding. There's something stalking me. I don't know what it wants, but almost every night, since I started seeing it, it has terrorized me. It doesn't touch me. It doesn't do anything. It doesn't communicate in any sort of way. It just fills me with horror. If what I'm about to say seems like I'm just rambling, please forgive me. I haven't slept in several days. We live in the second floor of a duplex, with stairs down to the back of the house, to the basement, where the laundry machines are. There's a door at the bottom of the stairs, before the door to the basement, that looks out onto our back porch and into the backyard. 6 days ago, I was going down to the basement to bring up some laundry, and I glanced out the door as I passed, and there was a dark figure standing at the far edge of our yard. Her back was to me, and she was just standing there. She was looking into the woods beyond our yard. She was dressed in nothing but a light gown. It had lots of flowing material coming off of it that was whipping around in the air slowly. The whole scene creeped me out instantly, but I thought she might be a friend of our downstairs neighbor, so I just continued to the basement. And then when I came back up, she wasn't there. The next night I went down again, and as I passed the back door, I looked outside. The woman was back. She was exactly like she was the night before, facing away, not moving. The hair on my arms and neck stood up straight when I saw her. I was even more creeped out when I realized she was in the same clothes as the night before. That's when I did something I shouldn't have done. I opened the back door. Leaning out, I called to her to see if she was okay, but she didn't respond. She didn't even make some sort of indication that she heard me. It was freezing cold, so I shut the door and locked it. Coming back upstairs afterwards, I looked out the window and she was gone again. Later on that same night, I was in the bedroom getting ready to go to sleep. Everything was dark because my wife had gone to bed before me. Our bedroom looks out over the backyard, and my side of the bed faces the windows, so I have to go past them to get in. As I was doing so, I got that same deep dread feeling in my stomach that I had gotten the first time I saw the figure in the backyard. Something compelled me to hesitate by the windows. My hands were shaking as I pulled the curtain back a bit and looked through the shades into the backyard. It was a clear night, so the backyard wasn't shrouded in darkness. And there she was. The woman was standing in the middle of the backyard, no longer at the edge of the woods, and this time she was facing the house. Her head was tilted up, looking directly at the window I was peeking from. I jerked away instantly, afraid she had seen me. Her face was covered in shadow and hair, but I saw her chin and nose, a sharp nose and a thin chin. Gray. Her skin looks gray, I think. Her hair is black and long. I was so scared I jumped into bed and covered myself with the covers. The next day, I played outside in the snow with my 4-year-old daughter. She wanted me to pull her on her sled in the backyard, but just the thought of going back there made me scared again. So I talked to her into digging holes in the snow, but in the front yard. When the night arrived, things went from bad to worse. Somehow, I had managed to forget about the woman. Then, in the middle of the night, my daughter starts crying. Our bedroom is just across the hall from hers. I thought she might need to use the bathroom or was just having a bad dream. So I went into her room to see if she was okay. She was uncovered, curled into a ball on her mattress. I pulled her covers over her, and that's when she whispered to me, "Daddy, there's someone in my closet." Instantly, I got goosebumps. I turned my head slowly towards the closet door at the end of her bed. Normally, the closet is shut, but now, it was open. As I looked into the closet, there was a dark shadow. That's when I saw her. The woman was standing in my daughter's closet. Not even when it was clear that I saw her did she move or make a sound. She just stood there and looked at me through the cracked open door. My blood ran cold when I saw her. "Get up," I told my daughter. "Get in my arms, quickly, quickly." She scrambled up and hugged me tightly as I walked backwards out of the room, watching the closet the entire time. In my mind, I imagined her throwing the closet door open and running at us, arms outstretched. I just hugged my daughter and walked backward into my room. The woman never appeared in the doorway. I heard no movement from my daughter's room. I tucked her into my bed and stood there watching the doorway to her bedroom. I didn't go back in. I just stood there and watched and listened. When I finally got the courage to climb into bed, I didn't sleep. Sunday came, and I told my wife everything. I told her about the first time I saw this woman. I told her about calling out to her and seeing her from the window. I told her that she appeared in our daughter's closet. She told me it wasn't funny, that it was my fault for our daughter's bad dreams, and that I shouldn't encourage her to be afraid of her closet. Sunday night, my daughter called me to her room again. Call me a coward, whatever you want, but I couldn't go back into that room. I called out to her, quietly, to come get in our bed, but she cried and said she was scared. I wanted to go and get her, but I was scared too. I told her to pull her blankets up and cover herself. Just cover yourself, honey, and you'll be okay. I prayed that it was true. I lay there, looking over the sleeping form of my wife and out into the hallway at the closed door of my daughter's room, and just kept praying. She kept crying a few minutes longer, but then she went quiet, and I hoped that she was asleep. Monday arrived. I put toys in front of the door to her closet. By that time, there was no doubt in my mind that this was some sort of ghost, but I still put things in front of the closet anyway, even though I knew a pile of toys couldn't stop a ghost. Monday night arrived, and my daughter didn't cry, but I didn't sleep. I laid there, looking at the ceiling, tense. Then around 2 a.m., I heard her bedroom door creak open, and I knew something was wrong. She must be scared, I thought. So I called to her like before. Just come to me and you can sleep in our bed, sweetie. But she didn't come. So I peeked over to my wife, and the woman was standing there in the doorway to my daughter's room. Her arms hung at her sides. Her shoulders were slouched down. Her gown was dirty, like it hadn't been washed in years, and it was hanging off her like torn rags. I wasn't taking a single breath. I wasn't blinking. I just looked at her, and she looked at me, and I thought, this is it. I'm gonna die. But she didn't make a movement, never even made a sound. I whispered, please, go away. Leave me alone. Sorry. I couldn't look away. If I look away, she will get closer. I was sure of it. If I close my eyes, when I open them, I know she'll be standing over me, looking at me. At some point, she was gone. It's like I fell asleep with my eyes open, even though I don't remember her disappearing. Just that I was looking at the doorway, and she wasn't there anymore. Last night, I laid awake, waiting. I asked my wife to shut our bedroom door, because the nightlight in the hallway was keeping me awake. It was stupid. I don't know what I was thinking. Like clockwork, I heard my daughter's bedroom door creak open. I held my breath. Then I heard the boards in the hallway creaking, and I started shaking uncontrollably. I heard our bedroom door open, and I knew she was standing there, in the doorway, not moving, just looking at me. But I didn't look. I couldn't. I did what I had told my daughter to do, and pulled the covers over my head. I'm a complete mess, a zombie at work. I don't even want to go home anymore. I think I'm starting to see the woman in other places, a glance while driving, and I think she's sitting in the passenger seat of the truck behind me, or standing in the street as I drive off. Just sitting here at my desk, someone passes by behind me, and I jump. I'm afraid that if I turn around, she'll be there, waiting for me to look at her. And what if I saw her face? But I don't want to see it. I don't even want to see her anymore. But I don't know what to do. The only hope I feel is that, for unrelated reasons, my wife has mentioned about moving, but our lease isn't up until May, and I don't know if I can hold out that long. About 8 years ago, my dad did woodwork and refurbished an old 1800s wardrobe, and he decided it would look good in their bedroom, which it actually did. After about 2 nights of keeping it in the bedroom, my mom started to complain that it was eerie and she had a bad feeling about it. I remember her saying that about a week later, it started opening itself in the night, and she could see a person in it, and that he talked to her. Of course, my dad didn't believe her, and kept it in the room, and it just got worse. The house started smelling, and the air became damp in my parents' room, and they didn't know where it came from, so they decided to look for mold, but they couldn't find any, so they just went on cleaning and spraying stuff to make it smell nice. About 3 months later, the activities got worse. The whole house was affected by it, and the doors in the house would unlock themselves. Shelves would open up by themselves, and the cups my mother drank from would always be broken when she woke up. This obviously scared my mom, and so she decided to sell the wardrobe. It ended up in the hands of 2 old people, who a week later sold it on eBay. We don't know where it is now, for obvious reasons. I also forgot to add, my dad, when he refurbished it, he found a panel under the wardrobe where a little red box that was dusty laid. Curiosity hit, and they opened it. Inside was an old cufflink button, a letter, and a strand of hair that my mother thought was off a horse, because she kept horses, and when one had passed, she would keep a strand of the horse's hair. Obviously, they put it back in the box and tried to find out whose it was, but they had no luck in finding who the box belonged to, so they ended up putting it back where they found it, in the wardrobe. I also want to apologize if this story isn't typed out correctly. I'm not very good at writing, but I thought the story belonged here. And yes, before you all start asking, this isn't fiction. This is something that actually happened. I experienced it. I saw a few things. I woke up at night and heard things and saw shadows. But all of these experiences were nowhere near as bad as the ones that my mother experienced. I have no pictures of the wardrobe or the items at the time. There was no reason to take a picture of them. But I'm sure I can try to find the wardrobe on eBay, on Wayback Machine, but the chances are very slim. If I have any luck, I will inform all of you. So to everybody out there, if you're out purchasing antiques or used furniture, please make sure you inspect them in detail. If you see something, don't open it, don't mess around with it, and return it before anything starts happening in your life. This is not something that happened to me, but to my husband and his mother. When he was 10 years old, we will call him Brett. His mother we will call Kim, and my brother-in-law we will call Mike. My husband moved around a lot when he was growing up. Kim was a single mother who left an alcoholic and abusive husband. Mike was an introvert, and my husband Brett was an outgoing all-American boy who always had to be doing something. They lived in 5 different homes and apartments in the same city, but the one mentioned the most is a 2-story home that was for rent on Maple Crest Drive. A week after they moved in, small things started to happen. Things would get moved, water in the sinks would start running, and the lights would flicker on and off. They had electricians come in, plumbers, etc., but they never found anything wrong. Things went on in this odd way for a while, but then more things started happening, like stomping on the stairs, appliances coming on by themselves, and shadows moving down the hall, passing their bedroom doors. Then about 6 months from the time that they moved in, the shadows started coming into the bedrooms. Brett often woke up to something moving in the corner of his room. He said one night he was sleeping with his hand over the bed, and something bit it. He also said that he would hear whispers, but they did not come in clear enough for him to understand. But the scariest things would happen to Kim. One night, she woke up feeling like she was being choked, but there was no one else in the room. She would be cleaning, and something would pull her hair. But she said that the scariest night was the night she was dragged down the hallway and down the stairs. Everyone thought that she was crazy. They didn't see the scratches, or the bruises, or the mental strain that Kim was going through. She then went to the library and got this book on the paranormal. The book instructed to put flour or baby powder on the floor. The first night nothing happened, but the second night there were prints in the flour. They looked like what a gorilla's fist looked like if you made it longer and put talons on the end. The next morning they packed their bags and moved into a women's shelter. They never figured out what it was. All they knew was that Kim and Brett were being haunted, and whatever it was leaving Mike alone. Every night, I lie awake on my bed. I lay there in the darkness, looking at the ceiling. I'm afraid to go to sleep, but I know that I will, eventually. My eyes are heavy, my muscles are weak, my head is numb. I know it's there. I can feel it, staring at me, waiting for me to go to sleep. I can hear its footsteps, walking around next to me. When I leave my house, it knocks over my pictures. It throws my books on the floor. It's laughing at me. It loves my fear. It loves making me scared. I want to throw the pillow over my head and hide from it like a child would. But when I do, it gets angry. It throws more of my stuff around. It wants a reaction, but I refuse to give it one. I stare at the ceiling, trying to ignore it. Eventually, I fall asleep, and this is when it takes over. In my dreams, it shows me its world. In its world, I have ate the dead bodies of children. I have tortured innocent men and women. In my dreams, I have enjoyed every sickening act of depravity. It shows me in its face. I stare into its glowing eyes. I see its rotting teeth buried with a charred face. I feel the heat of its breath in my eyes as it snarls at me. Then I wake up in a cold sweat. This happens every night. During the day, it's still there. It never goes away. It follows me wherever I go. It tries to control me, and I never know it's there. It only listens to its own rules, and it knows how to control me. It makes me hate. It makes me violent. It makes me angry. The other day, I punched the man walking his dog. As I approached him, he looked at me. He looked me straight in the eyes. I didn't like the way he looked at me. He looked at me like he was disgusted by me, like he was better than me, like I was absolute scum to him. So I just hit him in the face. I heard the snapping of his nose. He fell to the floor. His dog started whining and licking his bloody face. People ran over and helped him up while I just walked away, still furious about the way he looked at me. Days later, I learned that the man was actually blind. I live with it, but I hate it. I want it gone, but I know it has complete control over me. I don't even leave the house anymore because I don't want to hurt anyone else. However, when I stay inside, it becomes angry. It makes me hurt myself. The wounds on my arms and wrists reflect its hold on me. Each cut represents a day. Each burn represents a year. I have begged for help. I even went to go see a doctor, and he told me that I have nothing to worry about, that I'll be completely fine with their help, and he arranged for some counseling to help me. But the counseling didn't work. It never left me. It still makes it home within my head, and it still torments me day and night. The doctor then scheduled some sessions of electroshock therapy. I lost all of my childhood memories as the electricity flowed through my head, down my body, through my legs. My muscles got really tense. I screamed and clamped my teeth on the rubber block that was shoved in my mouth. Every second felt like an hour in indescribable pain. But after everything I went through, it still didn't leave. Even during the EST sessions, I felt like I could see it, standing beside me, laughing at me as I writhed in agony. It was laughing in my torture. Now I'm just here sitting and waiting. I'm waiting for the priest to visit me. My neighbor sent him over without my permission, but I'll just send him away.
God cannot help me.
I haven't been to church
Since I was a child.
I gave up on God. He never showed himself to me. He's never helped me before, and I have never felt his love. How can I love him when he's allowing this horrible thing to latch itself upon me? Have I not been a good person? Have I not followed the rules of his society? Haven't I loved and cared for anyone who's been asking for my love? If all that is true, then why do I suffer under the hands of this thing? There's a knock at my door. I open it. On the porch stands the old priest, carrying a bag. He then tells me if he can come in. Feeling polite, I let him into the house. I become uncontrollably angry. I begin to hate this man with all my being. This man does not belong here. He doesn't belong in my house.
He has to leave.
I then demand him to leave. The priest walks up to me and stands face to face with mine. I stare into his eyes, those Christian eyes that judge me, those Christian eyes that advocate death and torment, those Christian eyes that support everything I hate. I scream in his face. I yell at him to get the fuck out of my house. Instead of leaving, the priest holds up a coin and he tells me to hold it. He takes my hand and he places the coin into my hand. Then he closes my hand. I feel the coin begin to heat up. I feel it scorching my skin. I feel it burning. I feel it making my hand weak with pain. I drop the coin and stare at my hand. I can still feel the scorching heat, but there is no mark, no blistering, no sign of anything. What was that? I asked the priest. It's a blessed coin, the priest calmly replies. The priest then puts his hand on my shoulder, and I feel my shoulder become numb. The priest stares me straight in the eyes, then calmly tells me, "You're in danger. I know what's happening to you, and I can help you, if you will let me help you." He moves his face closer to mine. "Will you let me help you?" Staring into his eyes, I don't feel angry anymore. I begin to feel sad, very sad. I begin to cry as I stare into the eyes of the priest. "Please, please, just help me." "I will, my son, but you must trust me. No matter what happens, you must understand. I am helping you. Do you understand?" I nod my head. The priest says I have to be comfortable, so I lead him to my bedroom. He tells me to lie down on the bed, and as I do, he opens his bag. He pulls out a purple sash, decorated with white crosses, and lays it over his shoulders, so it drapes across his chest. He is then asking me if I own any belts. I tell him I keep them in my top drawer. He opens the drawer and pulls out 2 belts. He walks over to me and takes my hand. "Do you trust me, my son?" "Yes," I shakily reply. The priest then takes my hand and, using the belt, ties my arm to the headboard of the bed so it cannot move. He then ties up my other hand to the headboard with the other belt. My arms are outstretched like Jesus as he lays upon the cross. "Why are you doing this?" I ask him. "It's for your safety," he replies. He takes a Bible and rosary out of his bag. He closes his eyes and calmly chants the Lord's Prayer. Then he places the rosary upon my chest. I squirm as I feel the rosary burning my skin, piercing my chest as I lay on the bed. My arms are restrained, so I cannot move. I cannot take this scorching rosary off my chest. It hurts. My God, how it hurts. The priest begins to say another prayer, a prayer I actually never heard before. As he speaks, I hear a loud ringing in my ears. The priest gently takes my hand and continues to pray. I try to squeeze his hand to cause him pain, like the pain he is causing onto me, but in his gentle touch, my hand goes numb. He tenderly kisses my hand, then he continues to pray. He takes a glass bottle of water out of his bag and pours the water into his hands. He rubs his hands together, then he gently grabs my head, his thumbs resting against my temples. His touch burns me. Inside my head I feel such intense pain. The pain makes me remember the hospital, remember when doctors torture me with electricity. I scream, but my own voice doesn't leave my mouth. Instead, I emit a low gurgling sound from my throat. The water from the hands of the priest dripped down into my eyes, and I squeeze my eyes closed. The water makes my eyes feel like they're being ripped out of my skull. My horrid gurgling cries makes my throat hoarse. My throat hurts, but I cannot stop screaming. I have no control over myself anymore. The priest finishes his prayer and suddenly, my body goes completely numb. I stop screaming, and the only sound I hear is my hitched breath in the unbearable silence. Who am I talking to? The priest says.
Not who you see.
I appear to reply. My voice, however, is low and raspy. It isn't my own. Who are you?
Not him. Something else.
I open my eyes and stare directly into the eyes of the priest.
You know, Father. You know all too well.
The priest stares knowingly at me. Why are you here? He asks.
Because he's mine. Because he gave himself to me. Willingly.
His body is not yours. His body belongs to God. I couldn't help but giggle at what he was saying like a little schoolgirl. And then I tell the priest.
His body is mine.
No, it's not. This body is mine.
God has forgotten this man.
God does not forget his children. Say what you will. I will never leave him. The priest tightly grabs my arm. Leave him, he shouts in my face. Leave him, in the name of God Almighty. I command you to leave this man. You have no power, false prophet. I command you to leave this man. I command you to burn in hell. By the power of God, I command you to leave this man.
God does not have enough power to control Goliath, the great beast of burden.
The eyes of the priest widen, and he lowers his head to mine. Goliath, foul creature of hell, servant of the devil, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, you will leave this man and you will never return. My whole body begins to shake as I suffer my first ever seizure. I then stare at the wall. I can't feel my body. I can't control what is happening to me. Leave this man, Goliath. Leave this man and never return. The priest then places his hands across my eyes, blinding my sight. Goliath, in the name of God Almighty, I command you to leave. As I hear the priest speak, I lose consciousness. I awake on my bed, my binds are free, my head severely hurts, and I feel completely exhausted. The priest is sat on the corner of my bed. How are you feeling, my son? The priest is asking me. I feel exhausted, I reply. Is it gone? It has for now, but I cannot promise that it will never return. The priest places his hands on my shoulder. But if it does, then please don't suffer alone. Come to me. I will always be available to help you. The priest smiles at me before turning away and picking up his bag. Rest, my son. I'll see myself out. Father, I say before he leaves through the front door. Yes, my son. How is it that this happened to me? Was I not a good person? The priest then turns to me. That is complete nonsense, my son. Good people will suffer more at the hands of demons than sinners. Demons want to corrupt and destroy. If there is nothing to corrupt, then there is no need to be possessed. Then why doesn't a priest ever get possessed? We do, every day. We have 20 demons sitting on each shoulder, feeding us lies and trying to control us. That's how most people live their lives. They have demons walking with them. Some of them even have demons inside of them, telling them what to do, telling them lies about other people, lies about themselves, trying to get them to kill themselves, and ultimately trying to get them to go to hell with their father, the devil. So, if there are so many, how come you all don't ever become like this? Because we believe that God's undying love keeps us safe, that He will never leave us, and He will always answer our calls for help, because we are His children. The priest turns and leaves my house as I slowly lay my head down, completely lost in thought. A few days passed, and that Sunday, I went to church for the first time in 23 years.
God has forgotten this man.
Before I start the story, it's important for me to clarify that the paranormal here in America isn't seen the same as it is in Mexico, from where my father is from, and from who I heard this story. Here in America, at least from my personal experience, this is seen as nothing more than a cool and sometimes taboo subject to be into, and sometimes people consider it to be sort of a hobby. But in Mexico, on the other hand, it's seen from a much different point of view. This is part of our culture. The same stories that our great-grandparents heard are the same ones that are passed down to us. The stories of duendes, la llorona, nahuales, brujas, and even the devil himself. We're told at such a young age to treat these things with respect and to never take them lightly. To us, it's much more than just witnessing an old chair move on a blurry security camera, or maybe hearing footsteps in an empty room. It's part of our culture. So here's my story. My father is not the type of man to seek attention. He's a humble, honest, hard-working man, and as a result, I believe what he tells me. Since he could remember, he had the misfortune of being more sensitive to the paranormal than most people. What I mean by this is that all throughout his life, he has found himself face to face with most of the stories that we've been warned about. Even now, as a grown man, our entire family has grown accustomed to experiencing more than our fair share. It's almost as if this sort of stuff follows not only him around, but all of us, too. So this story takes place in Mexico, when he was maybe around 8 or 9. He was with his grandfather, who at the time worked as a watchman at one of his friend's stores. This specific store also functioned as a warehouse, similar to stores like Costco or Sam's Club, but on a much smaller scale. For those who are wondering, una bodega. It was around 11 o'clock when they arrived, well past sunset and into the night. My great-grandfather and his friend had struck a deal, and whenever he was on his shift, he could help himself to anything he wanted to eat, as long as he kept the list in order to make sure it wasn't marked down as stolen inventory. As they were getting ready for the night, my dad was told that he could choose anything he wanted to eat. My dad was excited to hear this, as it wasn't often that he was given the opportunity to choose anything from the store. that wasn't a necessity without having to worry about having enough to pay for it. He wanted to make sure he made the most of this opportunity and decided to go around the store looking for what he wanted the most. He finally made up his mind and settled on a bottle of chocolate milk. Now, for those who are wondering, a bottle of chocolate milk is something valuable, especially depending on what part of Mexico you're in, compared to chocolate milk or milk overall over here in USA. So he started to make his way around the store and eventually found himself wandering the halls in search of the fridge aisle. After figuring out it was in the very back of the store, he rushed towards the low buzzing hum of the dozens of refrigerators. All he remembers was, and I'll say this in his words, an indescribable feeling of not only pure terror and true fear, but also an endless sense of despair. As he turned the corner, he was face to face with a very tall, thin man. My father tells me this man had to have been at least 2 meters tall. His initial reaction was to try and run away from him, but he couldn't. It was more than being just paralyzed with fear. He felt an endless empty pit inside him as well as around him. He doesn't remember the face of that man, and he doesn't know how much time passed. He had lost his sense of where he was, and at the time, could not for the life of him tell anything except for the fact that it was him and the man in front of him. He does remember, however, that this man was very well groomed and seemed very well kept. Despite not remembering his face, he does recall that he was staring straight at him. He doesn't remember what happened after. He only remembers coming to his senses on the floor in his grandfather's arms, being questioned about what happened. His face was full of tears. All he could manage to choke out was that the man was there, over and over. His grandfather's first thought was that someone had broken in, and he rushed my father back to the front of the store, where the only lockable room was located, the owner's office. He told my father to wait inside the office, and that no matter what, to not open the door for anyone. He would be back as soon as he checked the store to make sure it was safe. But the memory of the man was still all too fresh in my father's mind, and he decided that he would man up and be brave by running into the man again with his grandfather by his side, rather than remain alone inside the store again. Despite his grandfather believing it wasn't safe, he could see the terror in my father's eyes and complied with my father's wish. After checking through each aisle and deciding that the store was safe, they both headed back to the office, where my dad explained everything. For the most part, it seemed to be an isolated incident, as my great-grandfather later that morning told the owner what happened, and he claimed it was the first he had heard of anything of that type of stuff happening inside a store. It is worth noting, though, that the store was torn down not 2 months later after this incident, and the owner seemed to give no more of an explanation other than that he was losing money. Despite my dad not daring to outright say what he thinks he saw that night, it's more than apparent to me that based on his description of both the man and the feelings that overcame him, I think it's safe to assume that the man he saw was none other than the devil himself. Before I begin the story, I would like to describe what certain parts of Mexico are like. I'm not talking about Cancun, vacation beach destinations that people be taking to Mexico. I'm talking about deep in the heart of Mexico, in the ranchos and the farms, where there's still no electricity, where there's no bathroom, no fresh water, where you have to walk outside at night in a pitch black field to go to the backwoods to use the restroom. I'm talking about everybody around you is a farmer. and those type of places of Mexico, which is pretty common actually. You might just not hear about it too much. So with this being said, I would like to tell a story of my mom when she used to do her nursing practice when she was in school with a native community in a remote place in Mexico. She said that the internado, internship, where she stayed with the sick people was across a bridge over a river, and on the other side lived the doctors. So there were times in the middle of the night when she had to carry a sick child to the doctors' houses where they lived. She said crossing that bridge at night was super scary because you could hear La Llorona crying out while you were crossing the bridge. Many of you who love paranormal stuff may have already heard of the word Nahual here in Mexico, and I would guess that also on some other countries in Latin America we call that way people who can shapeshift into animals. Well, here's my story. It was a cold night, I remember, because it was really weird for it to get cold on that side of the country. This was in my parents' house, in a small pueblo, or small town, and back in the day, it was one of the last houses outside of town. Not so many neighbors, but a lot of trees and nature around. The house has a long backyard where we used to have sheep. At one side, a small water stream and trees to the other side. The sheep then started to bleat very loud, something we could call screams. My father then went to give a check on a window in the back side of the house. I still recall his face when he came back quickly, and in a low, urgent voice, he told my mom, "Ve agarra a tu padre y a tus hermanos y diles que vengan ya ahorita. Go ask your father and brothers to come here immediately." They were 4 brothers, my grandfather and my father. When everyone was there, a few minutes later, my father started to tell us what he saw. In the barn, we had 10 sheep. At the moment my father gave a look, all of them were together in just one corner. At the center, there was some kind of big animal. My father described it as a bear, which makes totally no sense, but he said it was big, hairy, and it seemed to be eating one sheep there. This one sheep was screaming really bad. Then, my grandfather told my mom to keep us inside of the house and to keep me in there also with her. If you go outside now, you may catch a bad air. So he made some kind of prayer holding his machete. So his prayer, I remember he said the names of my uncles and also my father's. He then went outside. That's when my grandfather started to yell at the darkness, telling things like, "Vete de aquí, no tienes nada que ver aquí. Deja esta casa. Go away. You have nothing to do here. Leave this house." My father told me that he saw how this thing was in a pose, eating the sheep, which was laying on the ground, still screaming by the way. And when my grandfather yelled at it, this thing seemed to stop and raise its head up towards my family. This thing was only staring at them. Not a single noise, and also no red or shining eyes. Only the shadow looked like it was looking at them. So my father decided to do something at last. He took a big rock. He picked it up from the ground and threw it at this thing. Maybe not the best thing to do in this situation, but I guess this thing was not that strong. Or maybe because it was 6 of us and we all had machetes. But when the rock hit it, this being turned its back and ran away to the forest, running on all 4 legs like an animal would. They then approached the sheep, and my grandpa said how the sheep was on the ground, but it was still alive, but it was completely unskinned. It was horrifying, at least. My grandfather then sacrificed it to stop the suffering. After that night, a family friend told us a story about someone new in town that apparently was a Nahuatl. He told us he spoke to that man and he told him to leave the town. Indeed, we never happened to live something similar after that. The story of La Planchada. The ghost is a female nurse. Some stories say she was in love with a doctor who ended up leading her to take her own life. And in others, she is simply a vengeful spirit who doesn't approve younger nurses. And in other stories, she is simply a vengeful spirit who kills patients attempting to ease their pain. Yet one story that everyone is familiar with is the one of her at Hospital Juarez in the early 1930s, where she fell in love with a doctor who was secretly engaged to another woman. She was unaware of the doctor's engagement and began having an affair with a man. A few months later, he told her he was going out of town on a business conference, but he was actually going on his honeymoon with his new wife. While he was gone, a coworker found the woman waiting for her lost love, and the coworker revealed the doctor's secret. The nurse fell into a deep depression, which led her to contracting some sort of disease. This thing eventually killed her, and she is now said to return to the room where she died. Whatever the origin is, the ghost is associated with hospitals, where it can be seen walking the halls at night and checking on patients. This spirit is often described as floating or walking, but always silent, and in some accounts, it even glows. Sometimes it's said that she appears as a normal nurse, a full human manifestation, and other times, it is said that she looks evil with the face of a horrendous creature. And a small detail that always sticks out is the uniform that she wears is usually out of date. Despite the possible horrific appearance of this ghost, it oftentimes heals patients it visits in the night, curing them of disease or healing them, and then moving them to other rooms to recover. The patients who see her describe a nurse who appeared in the room and somehow made them feel better. Hospital Juarez, being one of the possible origins of the spirit, is known for appearances of La Planchada. It is said that the ghost returns to the room where she died and heals whoever is inside. So be careful next time you or someone you know is in the hospital and you all have a pretty nurse that comes inside a room to help you. She also told me that the hospital, where she was a full nurse, was haunted by La Planchada. She said some of their sick people would report how a really nice well-dressed nurse came in and helped them in the middle of the night. She said they would describe her as wearing an old-time uniform that hadn't been used in decades by nurses. But the thing that stood out was that they would always comment on how well kept iron the nurse's uniform was. Now here's the scary part. Sometimes when they were at the nurse's station in the ICU, they would know when someone was going to code because they could feel as if someone had walked by the nurse's station and into the room of a sick person, but no one was there. They would then get an alert that someone was coding. The nurses used to say that it was la muerte, or death, that would come and try to get the patients. Another story she told me was that when she wasn't practicing nursing yet, she was studying nursing under the monjas, under the nuns, and she said one of the dormitories was haunted. The two dormitories were divided by a hallway, and one day, all the girls were staying in the one that wasn't haunted because they were scared. They decided to roll a coin to the other dorm, and they said that the coin rolled through the hallway and into the other dark, empty room. A few seconds after, they heard the coin stop rolling and drop. The coin was rolled back to them. My dad told me a long time ago about a time when he was a teenager in Mexico, and it was late, and he was walking home after hanging out with his friends. My dad grew up in a rancho, and it was real dark, and the town that he's from is old. Anyways, there was no one out on the road, and he was walking, and he heard a sound, so he looked around at this abandoned house. The house was falling apart, and the windows were nothing but dark openings. He said he saw the back of a man sitting on the top of a roof with his back towards him. As my dad walked past the house, he looked back to see the man still on the roof, and my dad said that the man's legs were so long they touched the ground. I actually think my dad saw Slender Man long before anyone knew what that was. My family doesn't have a rancho or a ranch. However, we live near a mountain where there are 3 crucifixes, and each year in Semana Santa they replace them, which takes about 6 days. While they are gone, it is said that everybody in the community and around there says that the witches go out to hunt children. One year they heard chains being dragged on the roof at nighttime. My father told me about a time in the 70s when he was driving to his hometown in San Luis Potosí with my mom asleep in the back and her dad in the passenger seat. He said it was late at night and it was raining. The road they were on was empty and long and had lots of turns and curves, and the visibility was bad. He said they both spotted a man standing on the side of the road in the pouring rain trying to catch a ride. My dad didn't stop and kept driving, and my abuelito, grandfather, commented saying poor guy standing out in the rain. They didn't think much of it. However, my dad said that a few minutes later, after passing another curve, they saw the same man, again, standing on the side of the road. It was the same guy. They both freaked out and my grandfather said, "Es el diablo, it's the devil," and to keep driving. When I went to Mexico with my dad in the mid-80s, they lived in a rancho, and my dad told me to go to bed once because after midnight, some of the animals that have been cursed by witches start to talk, and they will come around looking for anyone who will talk with them. So if you live in a rancho, in a farm, or own livestock or animals of any kind, be careful if you hear them talking to you tonight. My mother lived in the countryside and told us of something that happened when she was a kid. She was asleep and heard a weird clicking noise, como una pluma, like the clicking of a pen. She looked outside and said there was a weird thing outside making noise. It looked like a humanoid, grayish thing. just standing outside their house, looking in. My mom then closed the curtains and started blessing the house, and she said that she never saw the thing again. I want to say this was a skinwalker walking through the neighborhood, whistling, trying to see who would whistle or talk back.